We all know the legend of Genghis Khan, the brilliant strategist, the legendary warrior who forged an empire spanning continents. But what if the most terrifying part of his story isn't written in the chronicles of battles and armies, but in a much darker, more intimate chapter of history? A chapter so unsettling, so forbidden, that even centuries later, it feels too monstrous to speak aloud. This was not just conquest with swords and blood. It was a new kind of war, a conquest of flesh, of dignity, and of forbidden desire, twisted into punishment. Behind the thunder of his horses and the smoke of burning cities lay a truth that has haunted historians for generations. It is the chilling, almost unspeakable story of what Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies. They weren't just spoils of war, they were living trophies, forced into lives of torment, and marked forever by the shadow of the Khan. Stay with me, because once you hear the full unvarnished story, you will never look at history the same way again. The world often romanticizes Genghis Khan, but to truly understand his reign, we have to confront a brutal question. Can greatness ever be separated from the horrors it left behind? For most rulers, defeat ends on the battlefield. The vanquished army lays down its arms and the kingdom falls. But for Genghis Khan, the true conquest was about something much more personal. To his enemies, defeat did not end on the battlefield. It followed them into their homes, into their very bloodlines. For their wives, conquest was not a distant story of banners and swords. It was a nightmare written into their flesh. When the Mongol hordes descended on a city, the men were often slaughtered, their heads stacked in pyramids as a symbol of terror. But the wives, the women left behind, were not spared. For Genghis, they were both spoils and symbols. To take the wife of an enemy was not just lust. It was an act of ultimate domination, humiliation, and the deepest insult. He wanted every rival to know, "Your bloodline ends with me, and your legacy will carry my shadow." The chronicles whisper of women paraded before him, their tears and cries drowned out by the noise of the army. Beauty, status, even innocence, none of it mattered. If a woman was tied to a man who had defied him, she became part of the punishment. This was more than revenge. It was a perversion of war. Historians recount a chilling pattern. The Khan's generals brought him the wives of noblemen, princesses, and even queens captured in battle. Some were spared for political alliances, forced into marriages that turned queens into pawns. Others were claimed outright, their beauty reduced to another trophy in his endless campaign. To be chosen was not a blessing. It was a life sentence. Many lived in the Khan's camps under constant fear, stripped of their former lives. Imagine the profound torment of a queen who once sat on a jeweled throne, honored by her people, now reduced to a shadow in a tent, a possession passed from conqueror to conqueror. For Genghis Khan, this was more than revenge. It was immortality written into every bloodline he conquered. His sons and generals followed his example, turning the wives of enemies into symbols of humiliation across the vast Mongol empire. The whispers of history say that queens and princesses from the fallen Khwarezmian Empire, from the steppes of China, and even from the far reaches of Persia were pulled into this web. Their dignity was stripped, and their futures became weapons in his arsenal. The chilling truth is that the empire Genghis Khan built was not just carved from the soil of nations, but also from the stolen bodies and shattered dignity of countless women. In a bitter twist of irony that history cannot ignore, many of these women carried the Khan's blood into future generations. His legacy spread not only through war, but through the forced unions that followed. This is a sobering and deeply uncomfortable reminder that what he did to his enemies' wives did not fade with time. It seeped into the very fabric of human history. Historians estimate that millions of people today may share his genetic mark, but behind this cold statistic lies a truth too grotesque to ignore. Much of that bloodline began in terror, in forced submission, in nights of suffering no history book dares to fully describe. Each child born from these unions was both a legacy and a scar, a reminder that conquest is not written only on maps, but on human bodies and souls. And yet what makes this tale even darker is the silence of the wives themselves. Their cries were never recorded, their names forgotten, and their pain buried under the triumphs of the Khan. History, as they say, is written by the victors, and the victors in this case were men who glorified conquest, not the cries of the conquered. The silence of these wives is perhaps the greatest tragedy. Their voices were stolen, their dignity erased, and their suffering was buried beneath the dust of the steppes and the triumphs of the Khan. When we read of his brilliance as a strategist and his genius in warfare, we must also remember the silent screams that were erased to polish his legend. Some accounts suggest that among these wives were women who tried to resist, who fought even when their kingdoms fell. A few chose death over submission. Others were forced into choices no human being should ever face. But let us not imagine them only as victims. Some of these women endured with a quiet strength that defies comprehension. Their lives were a testament to resilience in the face of unspeakable horror, living as quiet reminders of kingdoms that no longer existed. This is the haunting truth. Behind the title of Great Conqueror lies a trail of broken homes, violated wives, and stolen legacies. The world often romanticizes Genghis Khan as a man of vision, a warrior unmatched. But hidden beneath that glory is a darker crown, the crown of perversion, humiliation, and cruelty, carried out against women whose only crime was being married to the wrong man. And this darkness forces us to confront a brutal question. Can greatness ever be separated from the horrors it left behind? For Genghis Khan, his empire was built not only on military genius, but on the bodies and souls of countless women whose names history refused to remember. Every time we celebrate his achievements, we also carry the shadow of what he did to the wives of his enemies. A shadow that stretches through bloodlines, through whispers, through the very genetics of humanity. It lingers, haunting us, because it reveals the darkest truth of conquest, that the greatest victories often came at the greatest human cost. The final layer of this tale is perhaps the most terrifying. By the height of his power, Genghis Khan had become more than a conqueror. He was a force of nature, a storm rolling across continents. His enemies knew that once his banners appeared on the horizon, their kingdoms were already lost. But what truly froze men's hearts was not just the massacre of soldiers or the burning of cities. It was what awaited their wives, their mothers, and their daughters. The stories whispered in trembling voices painted a picture of horror. When a city resisted him, its men were slaughtered without mercy. But the women, especially the wives of rulers, generals, and nobles, were separated, paraded, and claimed. For Genghis, they were not merely spoils of war. They were a message carved into the flesh of dynasties. Defy me, and I will corrupt the bloodline you cherish. Fear spread faster than his armies. Many surrendered before a single arrow was fired, terrified not of death, but of what would happen to the women they loved. In a conquered palace, once gilded halls littered with corpses, fires cast shadows against broken marble. In the center, women knelt, their jewels torn away, their dignity stripped. Genghis would sit among his generals, his hawk-like eyes scanning the wives brought before him. He saw not just beauty, but the humiliation of his enemies reflected in their trembling forms. He often showed no regard for their pleas. Rank, beauty, and youth did not matter. By taking them, he not only secured his own dominance, but he erased theirs forever. The wives he took, the women he claimed, they became the silent architects of his empire, unwilling participants in a conquest that still echoes centuries later. Their fate is why Genghis Khan's name remains not only legendary, but cursed. What Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies was not just conquest, it was violation elevated into strategy, and that is why it haunts us still. The world often romanticizes Genghis Khan, celebrating his military genius and the vastness of his empire. But hidden beneath that glory is a darker crown, the crown of perversion, humiliation, and cruelty. This darkness forces us to confront a brutal question. Can greatness ever be separated from the horrors it leaves behind? Every time we celebrate his achievements, we also carry the shadow of what he did to the wives of his enemies, a shadow that stretches through bloodlines, through whispers, and through the very genetics of humanity. If this story shook you, if it made you see history in a way you've never seen before, then don't stop here. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications because more untold, forbidden stories of history are coming. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. And tell me in the comments, do you believe Genghis Khan's legacy should be celebrated, or should it be remembered only for its cruelty?